Have you ever heard the phrase, people don't change, and wondered, is that actually true? Because if that were the case, then why do we keep hoping things are going to get better in our relationships with our kids, or with our parents, or even within our families as a whole? If that sounds like you're not alone. So many of us find ourselves stuck in the same patterns, the same arguments, the same frustrations, the same feeling that no matter what we try, nothing really changes. Welcome back to Turn the Lens Inward. I'm Lisa Taylor, and this podcast is for parents who want a better relationship with their teenage or their young adult children and are willing to start by looking at themselves first. In this solo episode, we're talking about change, real change, not the kind we wish other people would make, but the kind that starts with us. I'm going to share part of my own story about a time when both my daughter and I were struggling and how learning to regulate my nervous system, set boundaries, and communicate differently shifted the dynamic between us. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why the person who is willing to change first in a family often becomes the one who changes everything. So stick around because we're answering the question, if people really can change, where does that change actually begin? Let's get into the episode. Welcome back to Turn the Lens Inward. I am your host, Lisa Taylor, and I am excited to get into this episode. Today, we're going to talk about change. I've heard it, you've heard it. People don't change. Well, what does Albert Einstein say? The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So when we talk about let's talk about our family dynamic and our children and the relationship that we have with them. We can even talk about the relationship that we have with our parents. They're all intertwined. These are generational patterns. These are things that have been done the same over and over and over again. So what do we end up with? We end up with insanity. People can change. I believe people can change. I don't believe it's for the faint of heart. I don't believe it's for the people who are really, really stuck. And that is the majority of society right now. But when you have reached a point that you can't go along doing the same things anymore because it's just not working, you're fed up, you're sitting in it. Perhaps this whole podcast is around the relationships with our kids. So we're sick and tired of the way that things are going with our kids, our teenage kids, our young adult children. They're adults now. Things should be different. They should have a sense of responsibility. They should have independence. They should be able to function in society. And that's just not the case with a lot of our kids. So, where do we start? Well, the whole premise of this podcast is turn the lens inward. We start with ourselves. So, you are the one. You are the one that is going to change everything for your family. And that's a big, heavy responsibility on your shoulders. And you're probably not even looking at it like this. I didn't look at it like this when I started to think, how do I make things better between me and my daughter? How do I help her? How do I guide? How do I clean up this mess that I had created in my life? Well, I wasn't thinking of it as, ooh, I'm the one. I'm going to do everything different. I'm the leader. No, I was stubborn. Stubborn is the next most stubborn person you've ever met in your life. It actually took somebody saying to me, pointing out how stubborn I was, for me to see, yeah, I am stubborn. And it made a lot of sense. My parents were stubborn. My grandparents were stubborn. People just get set in their ways. We are creatures of habits. We're humans. We do things over and over again. Maybe not because it's the best thing for us, but it is what feels most comfortable. So when you go to make these changes, you're going to be met with resistance. It's not going to necessarily be an easy go. People aren't going to go, "Oh, yay, you're going to change up everything and everything's going to be different." I'm sure some people want the outcome, but they don't want to go through that process of change. The process of change is hard. And today we're going to talk a little bit about how you can start this. So, when I started making changes, I was also falling apart. So here I am, this mess of a human, made so many mistakes, failing, thinking I had made good decisions when I made them, and realizing, oh, maybe I was a little bit too hasty in those decisions. At the same time, my daughter is also falling apart. So here we are, two messed up individuals. And really, what you do have to do is you have to separate that. You have to turn the lens inward to yourself. So that's what I started to do. And I recognized I had a lot of stress, anxiety, fear going on in my life. So if all of those things are happening in my life, what what's happening is I'm projecting those emotions. I'm projecting that state. I am the frequency of stress, anxiety, and fear. So it makes a lot of sense that my daughter was also expressing stress, anxiety, and fear. So the first thing that I really, really needed to learn how to do was to calm my central nervous system. There's a lot of talk these days around the central nervous system. It is running the show. And I always kind of visualize this zooming energetic bar going up and down my spine into my neck. I think in a past episode, I explained that I was under a lot of physical pain. But I'm going to kind of reiterate and tell you how bad that was. I was in debilitating pain. I carried it all in my neck and my shoulders, middle of my back. And it was almost, I would lay in bed at night and I would try to relax. I would try to just let it go. And I could never fully release it. And it took a long time for that to finally release. But what's happening is I realized I was in this chronic, constant state of anxiety and fear and pain. And I was holding my body so tightly because I never knew what was coming around the next corner. I never knew what the next bad thing that was going to happen was going to happen. Bad things were happening, and they had been happening for a long time. It's that phone call that you get, or that bill collector that calls. For me, I was in quite a bit of debt because I had stopped paying certain bills. I'd stopped paying basically the credit cards. For a little while there, I was living on the credit cards. And then I just decided, wait a minute here. Rent, food, gas, insurance, phone, they're my 5 important things. Credit cards, those guys can wait. I don't think this is something that I would suggest, but when you're faced with, do I eat and have a roof over over the head of me and my kid, or do I just pay these bills that you're not gonna get anywhere from? You're just gonna keep paying that minimum payment, and it's just gonna keep growing and growing and growing. It didn't make sense to me. I made the conscious choice not to do that. Was that good for my central nervous system? No, it was not. However, you gotta do what you gotta do in order to survive. This was real high level just survivor mode that we had reached, that I had put us into when, losing my job, and I was making it look like I could survive, and I was still bettering myself and growing, but at the same time, it was really, really bad. So I'm in this constant state of not peace, not peace in the body, but real stress in the body, and I'm also trying to make these changes at the same time. So people are recognizing, people in my family who were experiencing these changes were recognizing I didn't have it all together. And so, of course, they're thinking, Lisa's not making good decisions. Lisa's doing things that aren't the best choices for her. But when you go to make those changes, people are not going to support it. They're going to fight you all the way. And not going back to work was one of the biggest challenges for me and, my parents and even my daughter, people who feel that they have the right to give an opinion about your life, but they really don't. But for some reason, we accept it. We let them do that. So when we start putting up boundaries and say, "Hey, no, 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 no. These are the decisions that I'm making, and they're mine to make in order to make things better in my life." They can't see the long end of the road. I can see the long end of the road. When I made a decision to, uh, get certain people out of my life, uh, I made decisions such as, creating a Airbnb in my home for extra money, bringing strangers into the home with my kid who was totally going through a really hard time, and I couldn't count on her to be the most upstanding citizen at all times, but here I was doing that anyway. It was actually a really cool time in my life because I was making enough money to pay the rent, to pay hydro, electric, all of the things, and so therefore, the other money that I was making with my online business and my networking association was for those other things like the food and the car and the insurance and the phone. But it was really, really, really hard for my parents. One of the things that I needed to change in our family generational patterns was what other people thought of us. Not wanting people to know what's really going on behind closed doors. For some reason, that was super important, making it seem like everything's groovy and, everybody's fine and happy, and that wasn't the case at all. Everything wasn't fine, and not everybody was happy. But there is this belief that people don't need to know your business, which at the time I was really understanding of. But if you're always making it seem like everything you're working on and everything in your life is perfect, then you're not able to go to anybody else to ask for help. And because everything's a big secret, it's very shaming for an individual to want to go and ask for help if we're supposed to act in this facade world that everything is working perfectly. Perhaps you're relating to this concept. So, whilst trying to create these boundaries, regulate the emotions in the household, in my body, in my life, kind of an oxymoron because on one hand, we've got all of this chaos. And on the other hand, I needed to keep up this facade that everything was great. Fake it till you make it. Have you heard this expression? That was something that I was becoming an expert at. And it really wasn't benefiting me or my situation or my body, my health. These are all things that while you're trying to make improvements in your life, if they're not, if you're living in this false world, you're not being in alignment. You're not being authentic. That's the word that in 2017 to 2022 was very, very relevant for me was authenticity. So putting together boundaries, first of all, was this is my business. This is my life. And what I'm going to do with it is none of your business. I'm not asking for money. I'm not asking for help. I'm not asking for your opinion. Those kind of boundaries in a family dynamic that everything is everybody's business and everybody else has a say in how you live your life can be very in your face, blatantly not welcoming. And it's huge, huge, huge change. And because we've already discussed, change is not for everybody, it can just add to the overall problems and issues of trying to make things better. The reason that people need boundaries is they are essential personal rules that help define safety, comfort, and health in our relationships and our interactions with others. And these boundaries, they are important for not only relationships within a family dynamic, but also with friends, also with coworkers. And when we start to create them, it's difficult for the individual creating them because it's hard to stick with them because you're faced with so much resistance. You, one of my boundaries was for my parents. I was like, I don't want to take any money from you anymore. They were constantly trying to bail me out, wanting to reprimand me for bad budgeting decisions. But at the same time, they wanted the dynamic, the pattern was that they're there to support and it's almost like it made them feel like they had purpose as the mother and the father. So my boundary was I'm not taking any money from you anymore. And then I can no longer participate in things. I can no longer participate in, gift giving, going out for unnecessary meals. Restaurants are great. I love restaurants, but it's one of the first things that can go if you're trying to change save money or not spend money on things that you don't necessarily have the money for. So that was a real big problem for my parents. Um, it was difficult for me to communicate my needs and my expectations over and over and over again because they weren't used to this change. There were a lot of other boundaries that were created, but the most important ones were the ones between me and my daughter. And we both had come to a point where we had sat in the craziness for too long, and we now wanted things to be better. We no longer wanted to get into yelling matches. We no longer wanted it to be, I'm right, you're wrong. I did say to you that I was stubborn, and I was constantly, at that point, telling her that she was wrong, mentioning the validation from the last episode. I wasn't validating her. So, in order for us to create boundaries that were going to create an environment where we both felt emotionally safe, secure, and healthy, this is what my daughter did is she came up with this 5-page manifesto. She wrote this letter to me. It was 5 pages long, and I have the copy of it right here. It was highlighted. There was a summary, an overview, trigger points. It was absolutely fabulous. And it really defined what she needed from me, and in a way that respected what I needed from her. I would recommend sitting down and creating a similar document if you're at a point where the boundaries are needing to be established and it's new in the relationship, and you both want change, and not every party is going to 100% agree with the other party's requirements, but you're at least going to know what the other person wants, and they're going to know what you want, and it's going to be valuable for everyone. One of the things that she brought up in this manifesto, which I'd like to read to you, is a strategy with the acronym REST. And this stood for relax, evaluate, solution, set an intention, and then take action. And I think that this is a beautiful acronym to remember when trying to regulate your emotions, regulate your central nervous system. And if you're in a heightened state, relax, evaluate what's really happening here. Let's come up with a solution or set an intention, and then let's take the action. And this is what we did. I kept this thing, it's all folded and crinkled. I kept this in my purse, and I would read it over and over and over again. And my boundary was, if she was dysregulated, if she was under the influence of alcohol, I didn't want to be there. I didn't want to have a conversation. It wasn't going to be rational. And her boundary was, one of the biggest things with borderline personality is this fear of abandonment. And so I wanted to stop and leave, and her fear was me abandoning her. So we had to come to a really serious compromise where I would say, okay, so I'm at a point where I want to leave. I'm going to go and look for a coping mechanism that works for me. And then you're going to need to regulate your emotions and understand that I'm not abandoning you. You go and find a coping mechanism that works for you, and then we can come back together when we're calm and rational, and we've figured out how to continue on whatever it was that was triggering us. The other thing that she had in this document was a list of everything that triggered her. And triggers are typically projections. So if there's something that I'm doing or saying that triggers her, it's something that she's not necessarily able to recognize in herself that she also might do and say those things. It's it's all a crazy web. But to recap, regulation is a foundational piece. This is something that we need in order to heal the trauma, these generational patterns that we talk about, and the relationship between you and your family, you and your kid, you and your parents, whatever it might be that's not working. We take things so seriously, and really, I think it's wonderful if we can step back and remember this is just one life that we're living here. This is our only shot. And if we're going to hang on to the past, if we're going to hang on to that stubbornness, if we're going to hang on to the patterns, and we're not willing to make changes, we're not willing to be the one, then we're going to live in the world of insanity and do things the same way over and over again, expecting different results. And that just doesn't happen. So that's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. I love the comments, and definitely make sure you're subscribed to the channel so that you get informed when the next episode comes out. Have a wonderful day.